So I'm going to talk in this lecture about Plato's Republic and the parts of the Republic that pertain to aesthetics or to the philosophy of beauty and his views about the arts. Literary arts, visual arts, the theatrical arts. Um, the Republic, Plato lives, I wasn't prepared to give you his dates, but he lives in about the 300s BCE. His teacher, the person he had credited as his teacher, was a man by the name of Socrates. Socrates, and then Plato in turn, is credited as having taught Aristotle. Socrates, however, the foundation of Greek philosophy for all intents and purposes, he did not write anything. Plato used him as a mouthpiece. And Plato was a prolific writer and wrote over a very long period of time. And scholars believe that some of Plato's early work is more faithful to the original thinking of Socrates, and then Plato's later work reflects Plato's unique philosophy. And the Republic is considered to be an example of Plato's later work, a culmination of all his thought, and represents Plato's own ideas more than Socrates. The purpose of the Republic, for those of you who have not read it before, or the project, I should say, is the construction of an ideal city or a utopia, which through his spokesperson, Socrates, through that voice, Plato lays it out. Actually, Socrates is in conversation with two other thinkers, Adeimantus and Glaucon. There had been some other interlocutors in Book 1 of the Republic, but they are either gone or quiet by the time we come to Book 2, which is where I had your reading start. And they get into this project because the real topic of the Republic is justice, and Socrates says that if we are going to define justice, then we need to see it writ large. We need to see it blown up, if you will, and the only way to see it in that way is to see it in a just city. And so that's what the men decide that they are going to do. Book 2 is where they start this project from scratch, from the ground up. And they start by thinking in terms of what are the conditions, what are the appropriate ingredients of an ideal city. These would be, there's going to be first a division of labor among the artisan class. There will be 3 classes in the ideal city. They start by talking about the artisan class, the class of craftspeople. And they understand that people will be doing the jobs that they are supposed to do according to their nature. And this means that this will mean that they can then be most effective and most productive. This is evidence of Plato's essentialism. And by essentialism, we mean his idea that what you should do in life is indicated by your nature. That you have a specific nature that offers guidance and direction. In the ideal city, people whose nature is determines, for example, that they should be a specific craftsperson, or practice a certain kind of art, that nature is their guide. This may sound strange at first when we talk about if there's such thing as natural bakers or natural farmers or natural born shoemakers. You could think about certain traits that each of these craftspeople should have that will make them most effective at their job. For example, I had an uncle who was a farmer in Ireland, and he could lift two sheep, one under each arm, and he had extremely broad shoulders, and he had hands that were really quite gigantic. And I, by contrast, am not physically equipped to be an effective farmer in the way he is. This sounds silly at first, But it's not so silly when we start talking about the second class of people, which is the guardians. A rich, an ideal city, Socrates and his interlocutors determine, is going to be a rich city. And a rich city is going to require a class of warriors. Uh, this would not have been an alien idea. Scholars believe that Socrates was probably inspired by what was going on in Sparta. And Sparta was the famous opponent of Athens. By the time Plato was writing this, Sparta has had the upper hand militarily over Athens. Um, and um, and Sparta is, if you are unfamiliar with Sparta, it is at least in ancient Sparta, that is, it was famous for its rigorous training of its warrior class. Um, Basically, the young soldiers the age of childhood were taken away from their parents and raised in grueling conditions, released to the wild for a period of time to fend for themselves, and then they have to live in common messes, and it is a very tough. And there's of course eugenics is practiced in the Spartan model, which is the eugenics, the killing of babies that they felt would not be fit. So this is all in the background. For Plato, in the ideal city, Socrates says, well, surely there is going to be specific traits that a guardian class, a warrior class, will exhibit. And these will be agility and speed and fierceness and courage and, of course, strength. And when we identify these traits in individuals at a very young age, by the way, both men and women, they will have to be then trained specially. And this leads to a very important discussion here in book 2, which asks, what should these guardians learn? And Plato tells us, or through Socrates, he tells us a very famous quote. He said, they will have to start by learning false stories, which is a very curious way of putting it. But what he means is essentially myths or fables. And he reveals that he is very critical of some of the false stories that are being told or propagated in Athens at the time. And he principally incriminates the Greek myths. He references, for example, the story of Kronos, who was the father of Uranus, who was, gosh, how does this go? I always get confused. Uranus was the father of Kronos, who was the father of Zeus. And without getting into the details of that myth, because it's a little bit circuitous and dense, and there's a couple of competing plot lines. Essentially, Kronos castrates his father, and Kronos, believing that his own children are capable of similar treachery, devours each one as soon as they're born. The story is that Zeus's mother tricked Kronos, and he swallowed a stone instead of Zeus. And Zeus is raised in isolation, away from his father, and at a certain age, I forget the details. He tricks his father into, or he gives his father an emetic, after which the father that is, basically vomits the children, which are the gods, in order. It's a pretty stunning story, and if you're not familiar with it, you should do yourself a favor and read it. Maybe if I find a passage, I can post this on Blackboard. But this is exactly the kind of thing that Plato is upset about, right? These kinds of stories, he said, should not be propagated. What do they teach? What do they tell? And of course, we could talk about the character of the gods as well. Zeus is a well-known. Zeus was a bad boy. He had a penchant for raping. He would change form and rape. And so Socrates says, these are not the kinds of false stories that we should raise the children on. We should raise them on stories, that is, the guardians. We should raise them on stories, on the kind of myths that say things like, no one has ever hated one another, right? No one in this city has hated one another. That's kind of that's a controversial proposition, to say the least. Would you want your own child to be raised thinking that there's no such thing as hate? What's his idea? Well, the idea is that if a child feels hate, then the child will suspect he is feeling something alien and shameful. So the idea is that stories determine character, according to Plato. He goes on to give a list of guidelines for the stories in the ideal state. They must represent the gods as being wholly good. They must not represent the gods as changing. That's reference to Zeus. Good. So that is the general point of Book 2 when it comes to art. And this is principally the art of the literary arts, that is. Homer is someone in particular that Plato picks on quite a bit. I suppose the principal target in Book 2 is Hesiod, who wrote a definitive collection of the myths that Plato has a problem with. I'm next going to talk about Book 10, which has to do with the famous Platonic claim that art is mimesis. And why is that important, and what does that mean? Well, it's a pretty controversial idea, and I have a lot of fun with this idea. I teach at an art school, and when I teach my artists, when I share this text with my artists, I often ask them, really press them on this claim that art is mimesis or imitation. What you are doing, what I say to the artists is, I say, what you're doing, are you engaged in imitation? Is that really what you're all about? And that doesn't sound entirely accurate. But anyway, why does Plato arrive at this idea, and what does this mean for him? Well, to properly appreciate Book 10, you need to understand two other things from the Republic. You need to understand his psychology and his metaphysics, and I'm going to talk about those very briefly. The psychology is Plato's theory of the soul, which is discussed in Book 4. According to Plato, the human soul is tripartite. It has three parts. There is the rational part, the spirited part, and the appetitive part. And there is a geographical alignment of these. The brain, the rational part. Spirited part would be the chest. It's the seat of the emotions, right? When we're courageous, when we're fearful, or angry, our heart beats. So they felt that the chest is the seat of the spirited part. And then everything below the chest, the digestive tract, the sexual organs, this is the appetitive part. It is irrational. And according to Plato, it rebels. And it must be trained by the spirited part in tandem, or I should say, it must be trained by the rational part in tandem with the spirited part. The physical part of the soul, the desires, can tyrannize the soul, according to Plato. More on that later. And then there is his metaphysics, which is revealed in Book 7 through the theory, the allegory of the cave. By metaphysics, by that term in philosophy we mean theory of reality. What is real? Well, according to Plato, what is real is not the physical world. The physical world is populated by material objects that are in a process of change. This shirt I'm wearing here is very slowly degrading before our eyes. Come back and look at it in 10 years and it'll be threadbare. This hair is definitely degrading. The wood behind me is degrading as well. I'm looking outside my window. It is late spring, and the flowers are coming out, and the leaves as well. So physical things are constantly in a process of movement and change, um, and they what that means for Plato is that they are not. They are not. Plato, his prejudice is that existence or being and stasis go together. In other words, what is what endures. What is what does not change. And for Plato, these are the forms. The forms, the best example, to give the best example of a form, is illustrated, I believe, I forget where in the Republic, but he talks about a carpenter. A carpenter makes a physical table on the basis of an ideal. He has in mind a perfect table with perfect right angles, perfectly straight lines, and yet no matter what he creates in the physical world, will always have imperfections, even if they're very minute. And of course, as soon as he makes this table, it is degrading. It is starting to devolve and become decrepit slowly. So that's how he operates on terms of an ideal. Well, curiously, among the forms, there are a host of forms that that we are always trying to imitate in this physical world, which will always fall short. It's a very difficult theory. Philosophers have had difficulty explaining this and understanding this over the centuries. But the basic idea is that, for example, you have a form of justice with a capital J, and then in this world we are trying to emulate that ideal with physical manifestations of justice, small j, and we often, if not always, fall short. There is a form of beauty, which we're going to discuss next week in the symposium. Beautiful things, they share in the form of beauty. They never fully capture it. They will quickly lose it. There is a form of, there's, what else? Well, there's a form of the ideal city, which we are trying to create on this planet, but which we always fall short. The thinking is that there is this ideal realm, and those ideals are eternal and unchanging, and the physical world is a poor imitation of that. So, what does this have to do with art? Well, art, in Plato's view, is essentially an imitation of an imitation. A painter makes a painting of a bed, which is itself a physical imitation of something, of some other ideal that a painter, that the craftsperson was trying to make. And so art is at second remove from reality. It takes us further away from the forms, takes us further away from the ideals. And this is important because, as we'll see in the symposium, the ascent, the intellectual ascent towards those forms, that is the key to happiness, and that is the goal of life for Plato. This in book 10, where he talks about art in mimesis, he engages in a long discussion about what the artist knows. Homer apparently is often quoted by many people in Plato's time for expertise about warfare, education, and government. And Plato says, what does Homer know about these things? He doesn't really know any of these things. So, what does the artist know about anything? If the artist would know about if an artist, so I have a friend at my college who makes paintings, beautiful paintings, I should say, about horses and people riding horses. In order for him to most accurately portray the horse riders, he has to, it would be best if he were actually an equestrian. And then he has to, if he's going to make a painting of the leather bit that goes in the mouth of the horse or the reins, well, you know how he would be able to portray that most effectively? If he were also someone who worked with leather. So, what's the point? That the point is that if the artist is going to be effective at his job, then he will be other things. Plato has a constant is constantly asking, what is it that the artist does? The artist does not fit neatly into any category in the city. If the artist is going to be good at his job and make leather, well, then that means that he is a leather maker. If he is going to, get to know horses very well, then he will be a horse trainer, right? But the biggest problem for Plato is that that you should do in the ideal city, you should not be doing a variety of things. You should be doing what you do best. You should be doing one thing. Division of labor is the key. Good. So this leads him, he is also worried about the impact of art and poetry on character. This comes up in Book 10. And he argues that, that art will make us less rational. It inflames the passions. When people go to see a play, they may want to laugh, they may want to cry, they may want to get angry. But all of this inflames the passions and stokes our emotions and corrupts rational people. And this is a big problem for Plato. So he concludes this discussion in Book 10 by saying that there is an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Philosophy provides access to the forms. It provides access to reality, which in turn nourishes reason and allows reason to rule the soul. The poets do the opposite, and artists, I should say more broadly. They provide access to what is a mere imitation. They offer imitations that inflame the rational parts of the soul and take us further away from reality. So, there you have it. That's just a couple points. By no means is this complete or exhaustive, but I've talked about, or I tried to talk about, the major issues going on in your reading for this week, and I would be very happy to hear any specific or particular questions from you. You feel free to email them to me or to ask the class. Okay, thank you. Bye.